The stellar cartography of the fourth quadrant was a map of elegant, terrifying perfection. For the Aethelgard consensus, space was not a vacuum to be feared, but a series of harmonic frequencies to be curated. Their ships were spun from solidified light and resonant frequencies, drifting through the slipstream with the effortless grace of a needle through silk. They had spent 300,000 years refining the art of existence, shedding the messy biological imperatives of their ancestors until they were beings of pure, predictive logic and aesthetic symmetry. When they first encountered the metallic debris on the fringes of the Ophiuchus cloud, they did not identify it as a vessel. It lacked the shimmering displacement fields of a sovereign craft and the organic, pulsing warmth of a swarm hive. It was a jagged, ugly thing, a pressurized cylinder of oxidized alloys and lead-shielded reactors that vomited a trail of radioactive isotopes across the pristine void. It was an affront to the mathematics of the galaxy, a primitive shout in a room full of whispered secrets. The Aethelgard observers, perched within their crystalline spires on the Dyson shell of Prime Alpha, watched the data feeds with a mixture of clinical curiosity and deep, existential revulsion. The object was traveling at 3% of the speed of light, propelled by a sequence of crude nuclear detonations that rattled its very frame. It was a hammer trying to be a spaceship. Grand Arbiter Valerius IX did not use his physical eyes to behold the intruder. Instead, he felt the ripples it caused in the local gravitational manifold. The intruder was heavy. It carried with it a density of matter and intent that felt archaic, like a stone tool dropped onto a microprocessor. The Aethelgard had long ago mastered the art of mass negation, allowing their cities to float on the breath of stars, but this vessel embraced its weight. It was shielded by meters of physical lead and water, a brute force solution to cosmic radiation that the consensus had solved with elegant magnetic webbing eons ago. To the consensus, the ship was a tomb, a desperate relic of a species that had clearly failed to understand the fundamental laws of energy conservation. There were no signals emanating from it that made sense, only a rhythmic, low-frequency thumping of mechanical pumps and the frantic, disorganized leakage of unshielded electronics. It was a ghost of a civilization that should have died in its own atmosphere. Valerius IX authorized a standard reclamation beam, intending to pull the debris into a nearby gas giant's gravity well to be scrubbed from the sector. It was an act of celestial housekeeping, nothing more. The reclamation beam, a ribbon of coherent gravitons, lashed out from a hidden pylon in the Ophiuchus cloud. Under normal circumstances, any matter caught in its grip would be smoothly decelerated and redirected. But the intruder did not behave according to the models. As the beam connected, the primitive vessel did not shatter or submit. Instead, it shuddered, its hull plates groaning with a sound that could be felt through the sensor arrays as a raw, discordant vibration. Inside that leaden shell, things were happening that the consensus could not immediately categorize. The nuclear detonations increased in frequency, a frantic staccato of atomic fire that pushed back against the Aethelgard's grip. The ship began to spin, not with the calculated rotation of a gravity-simulating craft, but with the wild, unpredictable wobbling of a wounded animal. Then the leakage changed. The disorganized noise coalesced into a focused, high-intensity burst of radio waves, a medium so ancient the Aethelgard had to search their deepest archives to find the decryption protocols. It wasn't a plea for mercy or a diplomatic greeting. It was a series of coordinates followed by a single, repeated command in a language that sounded like grinding rocks. The translation took several nanoseconds, a lifetime for an intelligence like Valerius IX. The words were, "Hardpoint contact established, initiating counter-talk." Before the Arbiter could process the tactical implications, the intruder vessel did the unthinkable. It jettisoned its aft section, the entire nuclear propulsion assembly, and detonated the remaining fuel rods in a single, uncontained blast. The resulting shockwave was messy, radioactive, and incredibly powerful. It pushed the forward section of the ship out of the reclamation beam's focal point and directly toward the Aethelgard observation post. This was not a maneuver, it was a suicide lunge. The Aethelgard had forgotten that matter, when propelled by enough desperation, becomes a weapon of its own. The forward hull of the primitive ship, a blunt cone of reinforced tungsten and ceramic, slammed into the observation post's outer shimmer shield. The shield, designed to deflect high-energy particles and elegant plasma bolts, buckled under the sheer physical momentum of 10,000 tons of unrefined iron. The impact was a physical scream that echoed through the psychic link of the consensus. Inside the observation post, the pristine white halls flickered as the structural integrity fields struggled to compensate for the kinetic energy. Valerius IX felt a sensation he had not experienced in 10 millennia, physical jarring. The Aethelgard were a species of thought and light, yet they were being rattled by the stubborn persistence of a rock. When the dust settled and the emergency dampeners stabilized, the primitive vessel remained wedged into the side of the crystalline spire like a splinter in a finger. It was leaking oxygen, a corrosive gas that the Aethelgard avoided, and a thick, dark fluid that their sensors identified as a complex hydrocarbon-based lubricant. And then, the airlocks on the splintered ship began to cycle. They didn't slide open with the silent grace of Aethelgard portals. They blew open with explosive bolts, slamming into the walls of the observation post with a violent clang. Out of the darkness of the ruined ship stepped a figure that defied every tenet of Aethelgard evolution. It was short, thick-limbed, and encased in a suit of articulated steel and pressurized fabric. It carried a tool, a massive rotating drill tipped with industrial diamonds, and it moved with a heavy, purposeful gait that suggested the gravity of a high-mass world was its natural home. This was a human. The Aethelgard archives had a footnote about them, a species from a high-gravity, resource-poor planet that had been written off as a self-extinguishing evolutionary dead end. They were supposed to have burned their atmosphere or choked on their own industrial waste long ago. Yet here stood one, breathing through a tank, its heart beating with a frantic, wet rhythm that Valerius IX could hear through the floorboards. The human did not look at the shimmering beauty of the spire or the transcendent forms of the Aethelgard, who stood frozen in shock. It looked at the structural supports of the room. It raised its drill, and with a sound that tore through the harmonic peace of the station, it began to work. It wasn't here to talk. It wasn't here to join the galactic community. The human was a scavenger, a creature born of a world where nothing was given and everything was taken. It saw the crystalline spires not as a marvel of engineering, but as a source of high-purity silicon and rare earth elements. As more figures emerged from the breached ship, each carrying torches, saws, and pry bars, the consensus realized their mistake. They had treated the galaxy as a symphony, but the humans saw it as a quarry. The Aethelgard tried to communicate, projecting a telepathic field of peace and mutual understanding. The humans responded by igniting thermal lances that burned at 5,000 degrees, cutting through the harmonic glass as if it were common ice. Their minds were not open to the Aethelgard's touch. They were shielded by a cacophony of immediate, survival-based thoughts: hunger, cold, the need for air, the drive to provide for the deep warrens back on their home world. There was no room for philosophy in a mind that spent every waking second calculating oxygen reserves and structural stress. Valerius IX realized with a cold, logical horror that these were not soldiers or explorers. They were the equivalent of cosmic termites, driven by a biological imperative to consume and repurpose everything in their path. The Aethelgard's elegant weapons, lasers that targeted the nervous system, sonic waves that disrupted cellular cohesion, were calibrated for delicate, refined life forms. They did very little to a creature wearing 20 centimeters of lead-lined plating and powered by an internal combustion exoskeleton. One of the humans, the one who had led the breach, paused in its work. It looked directly at the holographic projection of Valerius 9. The Arbiter tried one last time to project an image of the galaxy's majesty, of the peace that came with joining the consensus. The human reached up and wiped a smear of hydraulic fluid from its faceplate. Through the reinforced glass of the helmet, Valerius 9 saw eyes that were tired, bloodshot, and filled with a terrifying, narrow focus. The human didn't see a god or an ancient intelligence. It saw a barrier to the resources its people needed to survive another winter on a dying Earth. It raised a gloved hand, not in greeting, but to signal its companions. "Heads up," the human's voice crackled over a short-range radio, translated by the station's dying processors. "This glass is worth more than the whole belt. Strip it to the struts. If the locals get in the way, use the breakers." The breakers were massive, pneumatic rams designed to shatter asteroids. As the first ram struck the central support of the spire, the Aethelgard consensus felt the first tremor of a coming earthquake. The era of light and harmony was ending. The age of iron and hunger had arrived. The Aethelgard military, such as it was, consisted of automated drones that operated on principles of elegant suppression. They fired beams of coherent light that were designed to disable electronics and soothe organic minds into a state of lethargy. Against the humans, these weapons were worse than useless. The light reflected off the polished steel of their suits, and the telepathic dampeners were drowned out by the sheer, grinding noise of the humans' machinery. A single human, pinned against a wall by 3 drones, simply reached out with a massive, hydraulic-powered pincer and crushed the drones into scrap metal. There was no artistry in their violence, only a brutal efficiency that ignored the beauty of the things they destroyed. They moved through the station like a slow, unstoppable tide of rust. They didn't just take the valuables, they took the wiring, the plumbing, and the very air from the tanks. They were a species that had mastered the art of living in the ruins of their own making, and now they were expanding those ruins to the stars. Valerius 9 watched from the safety of the Dyson shell as the observation post was slowly dismantled. He saw the humans haul massive chunks of crystalline data cores into the holds of their battered ships. They treated the collected knowledge of 10,000 years like common gravel. To them, the history of the Aethelgard was just more mass to be weighed and sold. The Arbiter realized that the consensus had made a fundamental error in their calculations of power. They had assumed that advancement led to refinement, that as a species became more intelligent, it became more fragile. The humans had bypassed that trajectory entirely. They had become more intelligent only so they could build bigger hammers. They had remained crude, loud, and heavy, and in a galaxy of light and shadows, the heavy thing always wins. As the first human transport ship turned its nose away from the gutted station, its hull bloated with stolen treasures, it fired its primitive nuclear engines once more. The radiation washed over the remains of the spire, a final, dirty thumbprint on the Aethelgard's masterpiece. The Aethelgard were not the only ones watching. In the dark spaces between the stars, other ancient civilizations began to stir, their sensors picking up the messy, radioactive trail of the human scavengers. They saw the destruction of the Ophiuchus post and felt a ripple of concern. For eons, the galaxy had been a quiet garden, tended by those who understood the value of silence. Now a predator had entered the garden, not a sleek, cunning predator like a wolf, but a blind, starving beast that ate the garden itself. The consensus met in a panicked, telepathic conclave, their thoughts a frantic blur of light. Some argued for immediate annihilation, a cleansing fire to burn the humans back to their irradiated rock. Others, more cautious, noted the sheer physical resilience the humans had displayed. If a few scavengers could do this much damage, what would a dedicated war fleet look like? They didn't have to wait long for an answer. Across the quadrant, deep space probes began to detect more signatures, thousands of them. They weren't elegant, they weren't quiet, and they weren't stopping. The humans were not sending diplomats. They were sending mining colonies. Each ship was a city of steel and smoke, filled with millions of individuals who had spent their entire lives in the dark, cramped tunnels of a subterranean Earth. They didn't care about the Aethelgard's borders or their sacred nebulae. They saw a galaxy filled with raw material, and they were hungry. The first colony ship entered the Aethelgard's inner sanctum, the sapphire blue star system of Rigel 7, and began to deploy massive, tethered harpoons into the planet's crust. They weren't landing, they were anchoring. They began to pump the geothermal energy of the planet directly into their ship's batteries, ignoring the protests of the Aethelgard who lived on the surface. To the humans, the protests were just more noise in a noisy universe. When the Aethelgard sent a fleet of shimmer ships to intervene, the humans didn't even fire back with lasers. They simply vented their waste tanks into the path of the incoming ships, tons of frozen sewage and industrial runoff that acted like a cloud of kinetic shrapnel. The shimmer ships, built for elegance and speed, were shredded by the sheer, disgusting volume of the debris. Valerius 9 sat in his darkening spire, watching the blue light of Rigel 7 fade as the human harpoons drained its heat. He realized then that the Aethelgard's era was over not because they had been outsmarted, but because they had been outweighted. The humans brought the gravity of their world with them. They brought the filth, the noise, and the relentless, grinding struggle of biology. They were a reminder of what the Aethelgard had tried to forget, that life, at its core, is a fire that consumes everything it touches. The humans were the ultimate expression of that fire. They didn't want to transcend, they wanted to persist. And in a universe that was slowly cooling, the species that knew how to stay warm in the dirt would always outlast the species that lived in the light. The Arbiter closed his eyes, disconnecting from the manifold. The last thing he heard before the silence took him was the sound of a human drill, somewhere deep in the foundations of his world, turning and turning and turning. The conquest was not a war in the traditional sense. There were no grand battles, no heroic last stands that would be remembered in song. It was an industrial process. The humans treated the Aethelgard territory like a construction site. They built massive refineries around dying stars and turned asteroid belts into sprawling shipyards. They didn't use the Aethelgard technology they stole, they melted it down. They preferred their own designs, rugged, redundant, and easy to repair with a wrench and a welding torch. They filled the void with the smell of ozone and burnt oil, a scent that lingered even in the vacuum. The Aethelgard who remained were not enslaved, for the humans had no use for slaves who couldn't handle a 12-hour shift in a high-gravity mine. They were simply ignored, left to wander the ruins of their civilization like ghosts in a house that was being remodeled around them. The humans weren't cruel, they were just busy. They had a whole galaxy to take apart and put back together in their own image, and they didn't have time to worry about the feelings of the furniture. As the years turned into decades, the fourth quadrant changed. The shimmering nebulae were replaced by the orange glow of smelting furnaces. The silent slipstreams were filled with the constant, thumping beat of cargo haulers. The galaxy was no longer a work of art, it was a factory, and deep within the lead-lined halls of their new capital on the husk of Prime Alpha, the human leaders looked at their maps. They saw the other quadrants, the other ancient empires of light and harmony, and they felt a familiar, gnawing hunger. They didn't need a reason to expand. The reason was built into their DNA, a relic of the days when they had to fight for every scrap of food in the mud of Earth. They were the children of the heavy world, and they would not stop until they had added the weight of the entire universe to their own. The next chapter of history wouldn't be written in light, it would be forged in iron, and it would be very, very loud. The scouts reported that the next sector was held by the Oraxen, a species that lived in the clouds of gas giants and communicated through complex pheromone trails. They were said to be even more delicate than the Aethelgard, their bodies made of gossamer and liquid crystals. The human commander, a woman with skin the color of old copper and eyes like flint, listened to the report while she sharpened a carbon steel knife. She didn't care about the Oraxen's crystals or their pheromones. She only cared about the methane and the helium-3 that filled their skies. "Prepare the harpoons," she said, her voice a low growl that carried the weight of 1,000 generations of survivors. "We're going in heavy." The engines of the human fleet ignited, a chorus of mini supernovas that lit up the dark. They moved forward, a wall of steel and fire, heading toward the next garden, ready to turn it into the next forge. The Aethelgard had called them a disaster, but the humans knew better. They were the inevitable conclusion of a universe that had tried to be too perfect for too long. They were the entropy that bites back. In the silence of his final retreat, Valerius IX watched the human fleet depart. He saw the way they moved, clumsy, aggressive, and utterly certain of their right to exist. He realized that the Aethelgard had lived in a dream of their own making, a dream of a universe that was orderly and kind. The humans were the waking world. They were the cold wind that blows through the cracks in the door, the hunger that never goes away, the iron that never breaks. He reached out one last time, not to the consensus, but to the void itself. He didn't ask for salvation. He only hoped that when the humans finally reached the edge of the universe and found nothing left to consume, they would finally learn how to be quiet. But as he felt the vibration of their departing engines through the very bedrock of the planet, he knew that would never happen. The humans would simply build a bigger engine and keep going, looking for the next thing to break, the next thing to build, the next thing to be. They were the weight of the universe, and they were just getting started. The Oraxen nebulae were ribbons of iridescent gas that spanned 3 light years, a celestial nursery where sentient storms whispered across the vastness of the Perseus arm. These beings were not anchored to the heavy elements of terrestrial worlds. They were entities of atmospheric pressure and electrical discharge, their thoughts moving at the speed of lightning through the ionized clouds. To the Oraxen, the arrival of the human fleet was not initially perceived as an invasion of ships, but as a catastrophic pollution of their medium. The lead-lined hulls and nuclear thermal rockets of the human vanguard did not glide through the gas giant's upper reaches. They plowed through them, leaving trails of soot, radioactive isotopes, and metallic particulates that choked the Oraxen's delicate sensory membranes. The atmosphere of the planet designated as Orax Prime began to fester with the chemical runoff of 10,000 industrial engines. For the Oraxen, this was equivalent to a person breathing a cloud of ground glass and battery acid. They reacted with the only defense they possessed, the manipulation of planetary weather systems on a scale that could scour the surface of a moon. Inside the command deck of the heavy cruiser Iron Sow, Commander Vane felt the ship shudder as a localized hurricane of liquid metallic hydrogen slammed into the forward shielding. The Iron Sow was a monstrosity of utilitarian design, a hollowed-out asteroid reinforced with layers of depleted uranium and vibrating with the constant, bone-deep thrum of a fusion torch. Vane did not look like the refined commanders of the Aethelgard or the ethereal Oraxen. She was a woman built of scar tissue and stubbornness, her uniform a grease-stained jumpsuit, her skin perpetually dusted with the fine gray powder of lunar regalia. She watched the sensor monitors, which were flickering under the intense electromagnetic interference of the Oraxen's storm shields. To her, the beautiful, shifting colors of the nebula were merely obstacles to the high-density gases her fleet needed to harvest. The Oraxen were pests, invisible ghosts that threw lightning bolts because they didn't want to share their air. She spat into a disposal chute and keyed the internal comms, her voice rasping from years of breathing recycled, metallic air. The Oraxen storms were magnificent, terrifying displays of natural power, but they were bound by the laws of fluid dynamics. Vane had spent her youth mining the gravity wells of Jupiter and Saturn. She knew how to fight a planet. she ordered the deployment of the atmospheric stabilizers, massive, weighted pylons that were dropped from the ships like harpoons. These pylons were not high-tech dampeners. They were brute force anchors equipped with gravity well generators that forced the swirling gases into a rigid, predictable pattern. As the pylons bit into the lower, denser layers of the atmosphere, the Oraxen's screams echoed through the radio spectrum, a high-pitched modulation of grief and agony. The human machines were pinning the wind to the ground. The elegant vortices that served as the Oraxen's cities were being stretched and torn apart by the artificial gravity of the anchors. It was a mechanical violation of a biological ecosystem, and the humans performed it with the clinical detachment of a butcher quartering a carcass. The Oraxen attempted to retaliate by focusing the planet's magnetic field into a singular point of heat, hoping to melt the iron sow where it hung in high orbit. The hull of the cruiser began to glow a dull, cherry red, and the internal temperatures soared until the crew's sweat evaporated before it could hit the floor. But the humans did not retreat. They had been forged in the fires of an Earth that had turned into a furnace before they escaped it. They wore liquid-cooled hardsuits and moved with a sluggish, determined gait through the boiling corridors. Instead of shutting down the engines to save the ship, Vane ordered the heat to be redirected into the secondary harpoons. If the Oraxen wanted to give them energy, the humans would take it. They used the very thermal energy directed at them to power the massive atmospheric scoops that began to drink the Oraxens home. Trillions of cubic meters of ionized gas were sucked into the maws of the human refinery ships, where they were compressed, cooled, and bottled into fuel cells. To the Oraxen, this was incomprehensible. Their entire existence was based on the fluidity of the clouds, the shared consciousness of the breeze. They could not understand a creature that lived inside a box of metal, a creature that saw a living atmosphere as nothing more than raw tonnage. One Oraxen elder, a massive storm cell that had existed since the first stars of the sector were born, tried to merge its consciousness with the Iron Sow's computer systems. It sought to find a common ground, a shared logic of existence. What it found instead was a digital fortress of primitive, binary code, reinforced by hardware firewalls that were physically disconnected from any external network. The Oraxen's vast, associative intellect was blunted against the sheer simplicity of human technology. The humans didn't have a planetary network for the Oraxen to subvert. They had miles of copper wiring and physical switches. You couldn't hack a lever. You couldn't negotiate with a steam press. As the Orax Prime system began to lose its atmospheric pressure to the relentless human thirst, the Oraxen's physical forms began to dissipate. They were literally being unmade, their bodies turned into the very fuel that would power the human fleet's journey to the next system. In a final, desperate act of defiance, the Oraxen Elder collapsed its own gravitational center, attempting to trigger a localized supernova that would take the human fleet with it. It was a sacrifice of an entire race to stop the spread of the Iron Plague. But the humans had seen stars die before. They had spent centuries living in the shadow of a dying sun. Vane saw the gravitational spike on her monitors and didn't flinch. She ordered the fleet to ride the wave. They angled their reinforced prows toward the blast and fired their aft thrusters to maximum, using the explosive force of the Oraxens' suicide to catapult themselves out of the system at speeds their engines could never achieve on their own. The explosion of Orax Prime was a silent flash of violet light that lit up the quadrant for a month. When the light faded, the Oraxen were gone, their 3-million-year history erased in a single afternoon of industrial harvesting. The human fleet emerged on the other side of the shockwave, battered, scorched, but functionally intact. They had lost 3 refinery ships and 4,000 personnel, but they had gained enough helium-3 and metallic hydrogen to fuel the expansion of the third wave for another decade. To Vane, it was a successful trade. She sat in her command chair, watching the repair crews crawl over the exterior of the hull in their heavy, insect-like suits. They were welding patches of raw steel over the holes left by the Oraxen's lightning, the sparks of their torches the only light in the dark. There was no moment of silence for the species they had just extinguished. There was only the sound of the air scrubbers, the hiss of the welders, and the low, constant grinding of the gears. The human expansion was a slow, heavy march across the stars, characterized by an utter lack of curiosity about the things they encountered. When they found a planet covered in sentient forests that communicated through subsonic vibrations in the roots, they didn't try to learn the language. They calculated the bored footage of the timber and the mineral content of the soil beneath. When they found a moon composed of high-purity ice that housed a civilization of aquatic philosophers, they didn't ask about the meaning of life. They calculated the oxygen yield of the ice and the cooling capacity of the water for their reactors. They were the ultimate pragmatists, a species that had reached the stars not because they wanted to explore the unknown, but because they had run out of room in the known. They were a tide of grey steel and brown smoke, turning every garden they found into a scrap yard and every sanctuary into a quarry. Back on Earth, or what remained of it, the High Command received the reports from the Oraxen front with the same bureaucratic indifference they showed toward a shipment of iron ore from the belt. Earth was no longer a planet of oceans and forests. It was a global city of steel, a tomb world where billions lived in the dark, tiered warrens beneath the surface. The sky was a permanent shroud of smog and orbital debris, and the only green left on the planet was the moss that grew on the leaking coolant pipes of the great fusion plants. The humans were not thriving. They were surviving at a scale that required the consumption of entire solar systems just to keep the lights on in the warrens. This was the secret of their power. They were too desperate to be merciful. They were too hungry to be elegant. Every ship they sent out was a life raft for 1 billion souls, and you don't ask a life raft to be beautiful. Vane looked at the star charts for the next target. It was a cluster of systems held by the Valshari, a race of avian-descended beings who built their cities on the tops of massive, floating mountains held aloft by anti-gravity lattices. The Valshari were known for their poetry and their intricate, glass-blown art. Vane didn't see the art. She saw the anti-gravity lattices. She saw a technology that could move heavy mass without the need for chemical rockets. That was something the High Command wanted. It didn't matter that the Valshari had never known war, or that their world was a masterpiece of biological and mechanical harmony. To the humans, harmony was just a sign that the resources hadn't been properly utilized yet. Vane tapped a command into her console, sending the coordinates to the rest of the fleet. The iron sow groaned as its massive engines began to turn, the vibration rattling the teeth of every person on board. The Valshari would be different, the analysts said. They had shields that could repel kinetic impacts and weapons that used focused sound to shatter bone. But the analysts had said the same about the Aethelgard and the Oraxen. The humans had a simple counter to every elegant defense: more weight. If a shield could repel a 1,000-ton slug, they would fire a 10,000-ton slug. If a weapon used sound, they would fight in a vacuum. If a mountain floated, they would bring it down. They were the masters of the low-tech solution to the high-tech problem. They were the species that had learned how to kill a god with a sufficiently large rock. As the fleet entered warp, the space behind them was left scarred and empty, a graveyard of beautiful things that had been found wanting in the face of human necessity. The iron sow transitioned out of the slipstream on the edge of the Valshari home system. The view on the monitors was breathtaking: a dozen moons, each sculpted into a work of art, orbiting a vibrant emerald-green planet. Floating islands drifted through the atmosphere, connected by shimmering bridges of light. Vane didn't breathe in the beauty. She checked the radiation counters. "Launch the breakers," she commanded. From the bellies of the human ships, thousands of small, uncrewed drones were released. They weren't carrying bombs. They were carrying magnets. High-intensity, superconducting magnets designed to disrupt the anti-gravity lattices of the Valshari cities. It was a simple, dirty trick. The drones didn't need to pierce the shields. They just needed to get close enough to pull on the gears. As the first of the floating mountains began to wobble, its anti-gravity field flickering under the magnetic interference, the Valshari sent out their defenders. Their ships were like dragonflies, made of iridescent glass and powered by the sun. They swarmed around the iron sow, firing beams of focused sound that made the human hull ring like a massive bell. Inside, the crew bled from their ears and noses as the vibrations tore at their soft tissues. But the iron sow was not a delicate thing. It was built with layers of lead, rubber, and honeycombed steel specifically designed to dampen vibration. The crew didn't stop. They put on heavy, sound-canceling headsets and kept loading the railguns. They didn't need to see the dragonfly ships to hit them. They just fired buckshot, millions of tiny, tungsten pellets that filled the space around the cruiser in a lethal cloud. The Valshari glass ships shattered by the hundreds. They were too beautiful to survive a collision with a piece of flying trash. As the defenders fell, the human breakers reached the floating mountains. The magnets engaged, and the delicate balance of the anti-gravity lattices was broken. The mountains, each home to millions of Valshari, didn't just drift down, they plummeted. The emerald planet below was soon scarred by the impact of its own cities. The beautiful glass spires ground into dust by the weight of the rock they were built upon. The atmosphere, once filled with the songs of the avian people, was now thick with the smoke of their burning homes. Vane watched the mountains fall with a grim satisfaction. "Send in the recovery teams," she said. "I want those anti-gravity cores intact. We need them for the Earthlift project." The recovery teams landed in the ruins, their heavy boots crushing the delicate Valshari art underfoot. They didn't look for survivors, they looked for power sources. When a Valshari poet, wings broken and covered in soot, tried to plead for his people's lives, a human technician simply pushed him aside with a hydraulic loader. The technician wasn't being cruel, he just had a quota to meet. He had 3 hours to extract the core before the structural integrity of the mountain collapsed entirely. The poet's words, filled with the wisdom of 1,000 years, were drowned out by the roar of a chainsaw cutting through the lattice housing. This was the reality of the human conquest. It wasn't a clash of ideologies, it was a clash of scales. The Valshari lived on the scale of the soul, the humans lived on the scale of the machine, and the machine does not care about the soul. By the time the Iron Sow moved on to the next system, the Valshari were a broken people, their mountains grounded, their songs silenced by the constant roar of human industry. They had been integrated into the human sphere, which meant they were allowed to live in the shadows of the refineries as long as they didn't interfere with the production schedules. Some of the humans even felt a twinge of pity for them, trading scraps of synthetic food for pieces of Valshari glasswork to keep as souvenirs. But the pity didn't stop the mining. It didn't stop the smoke. The humans were a force of nature, as indifferent as a landslide and as relentless as the tide. They were the weight of unrefined iron, and they were crushing everything in their path. Vane stood on the observation deck, looking out at the trail of devastation they had left behind. She knew that there were more empires out there, more civilizations of light and sound that would try to stop them. She knew that eventually they might find someone as heavy as themselves, but until then they would keep grinding, they would keep taking. They would keep building their warrens and their factories until the entire galaxy was as grey and hard as the Earth they had left behind. She adjusted her jumpsuit, the fabric stiff with the salt of her own sweat, and felt the familiar vibration of the engines through her boots. It was the only music she ever wanted to hear, the sound of a species that refused to die, no matter how much beauty it had to destroy to stay alive. The High Command was pleased with the progress. The anti-gravity technology from the Valshari would allow them to lift the largest of the Earth warrens into orbit, turning the entire planet into a fleet of mobile fortresses. They were no longer just a species looking for a home. They were a species that carried its home with them, a home of steel and fire that would never be satisfied. The stars were no longer lights in the sky. They were the white-hot furnaces of a galaxy-sized workshop. And the humans were the workers, their hammers rising and falling in a rhythm that would eventually break the universe itself. Vane looked toward the next star on the chart, a distant yellow sun that looked just like the one Earth had once possessed. "Full power to the thrusters," she said. "We've got work to do." The Great Weaver was an entity of profound antiquity, residing in the heart of the Sombrero Galaxy within a lattice of dark matter and structured thought. To the Weaver, the universe was not a collection of objects, but a series of interconnected intentions. For millions of years, the Weaver and its kin had maintained the equilibrium of their sector, ensuring that no single star system became too bright or too dark, and that the flow of entropy remained at a manageable trickle. They were the gardeners of the deep void, pruning reality with the subtle application of probability and thought forms. When the first ripples of the human advance reached their periphery, the Weaver did not see a fleet. It saw a massive, jagged tear in the psychic fabric of the universe, a void of empathy so dense that it functioned as a gravitational sink. The humans were not just moving through space. They were flattening it, their sheer, unadorned materialism acting as a blunt instrument against the delicate architecture of the Weaver's reality. The humans arrived in the Weaver's sanctum not with a bang, but with the relentless, rhythmic thud of 1,000 kinetic drivers. Commander Vane's fleet had grown, now bolstered by the salvaged anti-gravity lattices of the Valshari and the condensed atmospheric fuels of the Oraxen. The Iron Sow was no longer the lead ship. It was merely a scout for the Colossus-class world breaker, the great hammer of industrial progress. This new vessel was essentially a hollowed-out moon, its interior honeycombed with smelting plants and living quarters for 10 million workers. It did not use warp drives in the traditional sense. It warped space-time by its own sheer mass, dragging the reality of the fourth quadrant behind it like a heavy cloak. As it entered the Weaver's territory, the subtle probability fields that kept the local stars stable began to fracture. The Weaver attempted to weave a web of confusion, a mental fog that would turn the human ships back on themselves, but the human minds were too narrow, too focused on the immediate physical tasks of maintenance and operation to be swayed by abstract hallucinations. Vane, now promoted to overseer of the forward excavation, sat in a command chair that was bolted to the floor of a bridge that smelled of stale coffee and hot copper. She watched the monitors as the Weaver's psychic attacks manifested as shimmering auroras on the hull. To the Aethelgard, these auroras would have been a sign of divine presence. To Vane, they were just another form of radiation that needed to be shielded against. She ordered the activation of the lead slurry curtains, a primitive but effective defense where a thick layer of liquid lead was pumped between the hull plates to absorb high-frequency energy. The humans didn't try to understand the Weaver's intent. They simply treated it as a weather pattern. They were looking for the dark knots, the clusters of dark matter that the Weaver used to stabilize the sector. To the Weaver, these were the anchors of existence. To the humans, they were a high-density fuel source that could power their fleet for an eternity. The Weaver reached out, its consciousness brushing against the mind of a young technician named Miller who was currently recalibrating a plasma torch. The Weaver tried to show Miller the beauty of the cosmic balance, the tragedy of the destruction the humans were bringing. Miller, whose entire world consisted of the 3-meter-wide corridor where he slept and the machine shop where he worked, didn't see a cosmic tragedy. He saw a hallucination caused by a potential leak in the oxygen scrubbers. He tightened his mask, checked his gauges, and went back to welding. The Weaver's influence relied on a certain level of spiritual receptivity, a willingness to see beyond the self. The humans, hardened by generations of living in the claustrophobic, resource-starved warrens of Earth, had evolved a mental callous. They were biologically incapable of caring about the big picture if it didn't involve their next meal or the structural integrity of their oxygen tanks. Frustrated, the Weaver shifted from persuasion to physical defense. It began to manipulate the dark matter anchors, pulling the great hammer toward a nearby black hole. The gravitational forces were immense, enough to spaghettify any ordinary vessel. The human ship groaned, its internal supports screaming as the tide of gravity tried to tear it apart. But the humans had built the great hammer with the expectation of failure. It was not a single, rigid structure, but a modular collection of thousands of smaller units held together by massive, flexible tension cables and hydraulic dampers. As the black hole pulled, the ship didn't snap, it stretched. The humans used the gravitational pull as a slingshot, firing their main thrusters at the point of closest approach to gain a massive burst of kinetic energy. They weren't fighting the Weaver's traps, they were using them as free fuel. The Weaver watched in mounting horror as the great hammer accelerated toward the central dark knot. The humans deployed the grabbers, massive, kilometers-long harpoons tipped with Hawking radiation-resistant ceramic. They weren't trying to destroy the dark matter, they were trying to reel it in. The harpoons fired, burying themselves in the non-material substance of the knot. The tension on the cables was enough to warp the local geometry of space, creating a physical bridge between the ship and the Weaver's heart. The humans began to pump high-pressure exotic particles down the cables, forcing the dark matter to condense into a physical, manageable state. It was like watching a group of apes try to capture a ghost by throwing buckets of wet cement at it. And the terrifying part was that it was working. The Weaver's very essence was being bottled into pressurized cylinders and stored in the cargo holds of a ship that smelled of grease. As the dark knot was harvested, the stability of the entire sector began to collapse. Stars began to drift from their orbits. Planetary systems that had been stable for eons started to wobble. The Weaver, its physical manifestation tied to the knot, felt its consciousness flickering. It made one last attempt to stop the humans, manifesting as a towering figure of light on the bridge of the great hammer. It stood before Overseer Vane, its voice echoing in her mind like 1,000 dying suns. "You are destroying the foundation of all things," the Weaver cried. "Without the anchors, the void will consume everything. Your greed is a cancer that will kill the host." Vane didn't even stand up. She looked at the figure of light, then at her watch. She had a meeting with the fuel logistics team in 5 minutes. "You call it greed," Vane said, her voice flat and unimpressed. "We call it a supply chain. Your foundations are just unexploited resources. And as for the void consuming everything, we've been living in the void for 300 years. We are used to it." She signaled the security team, not because she thought they could hurt the Weaver, but because the light was making it hard for her to see the navigation screens. The security teams arrived with null grenades, devices that created a localized pocket of absolute zero and high-intensity static. They threw them at the figure of light. The grenades didn't kill the Weaver, but they disrupted the coherence of its projection. The towering figure sputtered like a dying candle, its message lost in the hiss of the static. Vane went back to her reports. The Weaver was no longer an entity, it was a nuisance, like a fly buzzing around a construction site. The harvest of the dark knot took 3 weeks. By the time it was finished, the Weaver was nothing more than a fragmented memory, its consciousness scattered across 1,000 storage tanks. The Sombrero Galaxy was left in a state of gravitational chaos, but the humans didn't care. They had what they came for. The great hammer turned its massive prow toward the next sector, its holds heavy with the literal building blocks of reality. The crew celebrated with an extra ration of synthetic ale and an hour of extra sleep. They didn't know they had just killed a god. They only knew that the pressure in the fuel lines was steady and that the bonuses for the harvest would be enough to get their families better quarters in the Earth Warrens. The human machine moved on, leaving a trail of broken stars and cooling nebulae in its wake. Vane stood by the observation port as they prepared to jump. She saw the distortion in space where the dark knot had once been a scar in the universe that would never heal. She felt a brief moment of reflection, wondering if the Weaver had been right. Would the void eventually consume them? She looked at the dirty, scarred metal of the ship's hull, then at the calloused hands of the workers on the deck below. She saw the way they leaned into their work, the way they repaired what was broken and built what was needed. The void could try to consume them, she thought, but it would have to get through the laid shielding first. And the humans were very good at building shields. They were a species that had turned the struggle for survival into a religion, and their god was the hammer. The next destination was the crystalline lattice, a region of space where a race called the Shardmind lived. They were beings of pure mathematics, existing as a series of fractal crystals that floated in the vacuum. They were said to be the most intelligent life forms in the galaxy, capable of calculating the position of every atom in the universe. Vane didn't care about their intelligence. She had read the mineralogical reports. The Shardmind were composed of ultra-high purity quartz and rare earth dopants. To the humans, the most intelligent life forms in the galaxy were just a giant, floating semiconductor mine. Vane felt the familiar thrum of the engines as the great hammer entered the slipstream. She picked up a wrench that had been left on the console and turned it over in her hands. It was heavy, simple, and effective, just like them. In the dark warrens of Earth, the news of the Weaver's defeat was met with a brief mention on the evening news cycles, wedged between a report on iron ore quotas and a segment on the rising cost of recycled water. The people of Earth didn't need to know about the Weaver's philosophy or the collapse of the Sombrero Galaxy. They only needed to know that the lights would stay on for another year. The High Command, however, was already looking beyond the crystalline lattice. They saw a galaxy that was finally being put to use, a universe that was being organized into a giant, efficient machine. They were the architects of a new reality, one where the weight of iron was the only law and the hunger of the human race was the only constant. The era of the gardeners was over, the era of the miners had begun, and there was a lot of digging left to do. The great hammer emerged from the slipstream on the edge of the crystalline lattice. The space here was filled with a haunting, geometric beauty. Massive fractal structures, miles long, drifted in perfect synchronization, reflecting the light of a nearby pulsar in a dizzying array of colors. The Shardmind began to transmit a signal, not a language, but a mathematical proof of their own right to exist, a sequence of numbers that described the fundamental constants of the universe. The human response was a series of seismic charges fired into the center of the largest fractal. The explosion didn't just shatter the crystal, it broke the mathematics. The Shardmind's calculations could not account for a species that would destroy a perfect formula just to get at the variables. As the first shards of the intelligent crystals were hauled into the human crushers, the galaxy felt another shudder of despair. The weight was increasing, and nothing was sacred. The crystalline lattice was a realm of absolute silence and terrifying precision. Here the Shardmind existed not as individuals, but as a vast, distributed processing array that used the gravitational lensing of a nearby pulsar to synchronize their thoughts. To them, the universe was a giant equation waiting to be solved, and they were the variables that gave it meaning. Their structures were fractals of high-purity silica and exotic doped elements, grown over millions of years into shapes that maximized light gathering and data storage. They had no concept of physical conflict. In their world, a disagreement was settled by the presentation of a superior mathematical proof. When the great hammer of industrial progress appeared on their sensors, the Shardmind did not perceive a threat. They perceived a localized anomaly, a collection of high-entropy matter that seemed to be moving in defiance of the most efficient orbital paths. They began to transmit the fundamental constants of the universe, expecting the newcomers to recognize the universal language of logic and adjust their trajectory accordingly. The humans did not adjust. Overseer Vane watched the light show on her main view screen with the tired eyes of a woman who had seen too many wonders and found none of them useful. The shard mine's transmissions were being picked up by the ship's computers, but the translation software merely flagged them as high-bandwidth white noise. Vane wasn't interested in the shard mine's math. She was interested in their composition. The mineralogical scanners were returning readings that made the logistics officers weep with joy. The fractal structures were composed of semiconductor-grade silicon, doped with concentrations of neodymium and yttrium that occurred nowhere else in nature. It was a literal mountain of processed electronics floating in the void. Vane leaned forward, her fingers tapping a rhythm on the armrest of her chair. She didn't order a greeting. She ordered the deployment of the shatter belts, rings of high-velocity railguns designed to deliver a specific frequency of kinetic impact. The first volley of tungsten slugs hit the central hub of the shard mine with a force that sent shockwaves through the entire lattice. In the vacuum, there was no sound, but the visual of the impact was a violent eruption of glittering dust. The shard mine's collective consciousness experienced something it had never before encountered, an unsolvable variable. Their calculations assumed that all sentient life sought to preserve complexity. The humans, however, were actively seeking to reduce complexity into raw tonnage. The shard mine tried to compensate, shifting their fractal geometry to create a dispersive surface that would deflect the slugs. It was a masterpiece of reactive engineering, a beautiful dance of shifting planes and shimmering light. The humans responded by changing the slugs to sticky bombs, low-velocity canisters filled with industrial adhesive and thermite. The bombs didn't bounce off. They clung to the pristine crystals and burned, melting the delicate circuitry of the shard mine's thoughts. Inside the great hammer, the atmosphere was one of grueling, focused industry. The workers in the smelting bays were already prepping the crucibles. They didn't see the shard mine as living beings. They saw them as the quarry. There was a deep-seated disconnect in the human psyche, a survival mechanism honed over centuries of scarcity. If a thing had value, it was a resource. If it didn't have value, it was an obstacle. The idea that a thing could be both sentient and a resource was a philosophical nuance that the humans had no time for. They moved with a heavy, rhythmic efficiency, their lives dictated by the sound of the shift whistle and the rumble of the conveyor belts. The shard mine's frantic attempts to communicate, flashing patterns of light that represented the prime numbers, the golden ratio, the secrets of the atom, were ignored. The humans were busy loading the next round of thermite. The shard mine, realizing that their logic was failing, attempted a desperate maneuver. They used their gravitational synchronization to pull the pulsar's beam toward the human fleet, intending to incinerate the great hammer with a burst of gamma radiation. It was a precise, elegant solution to a messy problem, but the humans were a species that lived in lead boxes. The great hammer was not a ship so much as it was a mobile bunker. When the gamma burst hit, the outer layers of the ship's shielding vaporized, creating a cloud of plasma that actually acted as an additional layer of protection. Inside, the radiation alarms howled, and the crew retreated to the innermost core of the vessel, but they didn't stop the harvest. They used the heat from the pulsar's beam to supplement their own smelting furnaces. They were literally using their enemy's weapon to melt their enemies' bodies. Overseer Vane watched the temperature gauges rise. The bridge was sweltering, the air smelling of toasted insulation and ozone. She saw the shard mine's structures beginning to crumble under the heat and the constant bombardment. "They're trying too hard to be smart," she muttered to her navigator. They're thinking 10 steps ahead when they should be worried about the boot that's currently on their neck. She ordered the launch of the vacuum clamps. These were massive, spider-like drones that latched onto the larger shards of the shard mind and began to physically drag them toward the great hammer's maw. The shards pulsed with light, a silent scream of 1,000 minds being disconnected from the lattice, but the clamps were relentless. They were built of heavy, unrefined iron, and they didn't care about the mathematics of the thing they were crushing. One particular shard, a towering spire of violet crystal that held the equivalent of the shard mine's historical archives, was dragged into the primary crusher. As the hydraulic rams began to close, it emitted a final, powerful burst of electromagnetic energy. This wasn't a weapon, it was a data dump, a desperate attempt to pass on their knowledge to their killers. The ship's internal screens flickered, showing brief, haunting images of the shard mine's history, the birth of their star, the slow growth of their first fractile, the millions of years they had spent contemplating the nature of infinity. A young comms officer, mesmerized by the images, hesitated with his hand over the clear buffer button. Vane walked over and pressed it for him. "Don't get distracted," she said, her voice not unkind but utterly firm. "Data doesn't keep the heaters running, silicon does. The destruction of the crystalline lattice took months. The humans didn't leave until every significant shard had been processed. The pulsar, once the center of a glorious, thinking network, was now just a lonely star illuminating a field of gray dust. The shard mind were gone, their infinite wisdom reduced to a series of high-grade processor chips that would be installed in the next generation of human mining drones. It was an irony that the shard mind would have appreciated had they still existed. Their intellect was being used to facilitate the destruction of the next system. But for the humans, it wasn't irony, it was just an upgrade. The Great Hammer was now more efficient, its systems running on the literal brains of its previous victims. The weight of the ship had increased, but its movement was smoother, its calculations faster. The fleet moved on to the Velvet Nebula, home to the Flight, a species of bioluminescent cephalopods that lived in the liquid diamond oceans of a rogue planet. The Flight were poets of the deep, communicating through complex patterns of light and ink. They had no technology in the human sense, but they had a deep understanding of the fluid dynamics of their world. When the Great Hammer arrived and began to deploy its massive thermal drills to pierce the diamond crust, the Flight didn't fight back with weapons. They swam to the surface and projected an image of a single, perfect teardrop. It was a plea for mercy that transcended language. Vane saw it on the monitors and remarked that the diamond yield from the crust was going to be even higher than anticipated. The teardrop was ignored and the drills moved in. This was the pattern of the human advance. It was a march of the mundane against the miraculous. To the humans, the galaxy was not a place of wonder, but a warehouse with very poor lighting. They were the ultimate consumers, a species that had been forced to eat its own home and was now looking for dessert. They weren't evil. Evil required an emotional investment that the humans couldn't afford. They were just heavy. They were the lead in the gold, the rust on the chrome. And as they moved deeper into the galactic core, the empires of the old world began to realize that their elegance was their greatest weakness. You cannot stop a landslide by explaining the beauty of the mountain to it. You can only get out of the way or be buried. Vane spent her nights in her small, cramped cabin, staring at a piece of Valshari glass she had kept. It was a small, delicate bird, frozen in mid-flight. Sometimes she wondered what it would be like to live in a world where something as fragile as this could exist without being crushed. But then she would hear the thrum of the engines, the sound of the air scrubbers, and the distant, muffled clanging of the foundry, and she would feel a sense of security that the glass bird could never provide. The bird was beautiful, but the ship was safe, and in a universe that was trying to kill you with vacuum, radiation, and time, safe was the only thing that mattered. She put the bird back in its lead-lined box and went to sleep, dreaming of the next quarry. The High Command on Earth was already planning the Great Leap, a plan to move the entire human population into a fleet of world ships that would leave the Milky Way entirely. They had calculated that even with the resources of this galaxy, the human hunger would eventually outpace the supply. They needed more mass, more energy, more room to grow. They were already looking at Andromeda, not as a point of light in the sky, but as a fresh larder. The conquest of the Milky Way was just the first phase of an industrial expansion that would eventually span the local group. The humans were no longer just a species, they were a geological event on a galactic scale. As the Great Hammer began its transit through the Velvet Nebula, Vane received a message from a scout ship further ahead. They had found something new, a barrier of solid light that spanned an entire star system, a structure that didn't appear on any of the ancient maps. It was the last redoubt of the Consensus, a place where the remnants of the Aethelgard, the Oraxen, and the Valshari had fled to make a final stand. They had pooled their remaining technology to create a shield that was, theoretically, impenetrable. Vane looked at the report and felt a rare spark of genuine interest. An impenetrable shield was just a puzzle that required a bigger hammer. "Tell the foundry to start casting the breaker heads," she ordered. "We're going to see how much pressure that light can take." The great hammer surged forward, its engines vomiting fire into the velvet clouds of the nebula. It carried with it the weight of 1 billion souls, the debris of 12 civilizations, and the cold, hard certainty of a species that had forgotten how to stop. The final battle for the galaxy wouldn't be fought over ideals or territory, it would be fought over the simple physical reality of who could push harder. And the humans had spent their entire history learning how to push. They were the children of the heavy world, and they were coming for the light. Vane adjusted her jumpsuit, feeling the familiar grit of industrial dust against her skin, and looked toward the glowing barrier in the distance. To her, it wasn't a last stand. It was just another day at the office. The breaker heads were massive cones of depleted uranium, each the size of a city block, equipped with their own independent thrusters and magnetic guidance systems. They were designed for one purpose: to be thrown at high speed against a stationary target. They were the ultimate expression of human tactical philosophy. Why use a laser when you can use a rock? As the fleet approached the last redoubt, Vane could see the shimmering wall of the shield. It was beautiful, a translucent veil of gold and azure that hummed with a frequency of pure peace. It was the most beautiful thing the humans had ever encountered. "Launch the first wave," Vane said. The vacuum was filled with the roar of the breakerhead's engines as they accelerated toward the light. The collision was coming, and for the first time in eons, the galaxy held its breath. The golden barrier of the last redoubt was a masterpiece of unified physics, a multidimensional weave of coherent photons and solidified gravity. It was not merely a wall, it was a sanctuary where the laws of the universe were being held in a static, perfect state. Inside, the survivors of the Aethelgard consensus, the fleeing Oraxen clouds, and the grounded Valshari poets lived in a forced harmony, their various technologies lashed together to maintain a singular, impenetrable shell. They had surrendered their empires, their moons, and their histories just to preserve this one pocket of space. When the human fleet arrived, the redoubt's defenders did not send out ships to meet them. They simply increased the resonant frequency of the shield. They believed that no physical matter, no matter how dense or how fast, could penetrate a wall made of the fundamental energy of 100 suns. They watched the monitors as the first wave of human breakerheads approached, expecting the massive uranium cones to simply vaporize upon contact with the light. The collision was a tectonic event on a celestial scale. When the first breakerhead struck the shield, it did not vaporize. The humans had coated the prows of the cones with a layer of ablated shard-mined silica and Oraxen atmospheric ice, creating a thermal buffer that absorbed the initial energy of the light wall. The shield buckled, the golden surface rippling like water under a hammer blow. The kinetic energy of 10 million tons of uranium moving at a fraction of light speed had to go somewhere. It didn't burn the cone, it pushed the shield. Inside the redoubt, the artificial suns flickered. The Aethelgard priests of logic felt a shudder in their psychic link, a cold, mechanical pressure that didn't care about their resonance. The first break ahead eventually melted into a slag of radioactive glass, but it had left a microscopic fracture in the shield's geometry. And the humans had 10,000 more. Overseer Vane watched the telemetry from the Great Hammer. The bridge was a cacophony of shouting technicians and the screaming of metal under stress. The Great Hammer itself was now being used as a secondary projectile, its massive engines pushing it forward to keep the pressure on the breach. "The shield is bleeding energy," the lead analyst reported, his face illuminated by the harsh red glare of the proximity alarms. "But it's self-healing. At this rate, we'll run out of mass before they run out of light." Vane didn't blink. She knew the secret of the human race wasn't just their hammers, it was their willingness to use everything as a hammer. She turned to the logistics officer. "Begin the mass induction, strip the interior decks, feed the auxiliary reactors with the structural supports of the lower quarters. If it isn't holding the hull together, I want it in the fuel lines." Inside the ship, the desperate reality of human survival reached its peak. Workers began to dismantle their own living spaces, ripping out the steel bunk beds, the plumbing, and the very lockers that held their meager possessions. They fed the raw metal into the ship's reclamation furnaces to keep the engines firing. They were literally consuming their home to fuel their attack. There was no protest, no riot. They understood the math of the situation. If they didn't break the shield, they would drift in the void until their oxygen ran out. If they did break the shield, they would have a new world. It was a gamble they had been making since the first cavemen decided to burn their last scraps of fur to keep the fire going through the night. The Great Hammer began to glow with a terrifying intensity as its engines pushed past their safety limits, the vibrations so violent that it began to liquefy the grease in the bearings. The defenders of the redoubt were horrified. They could see the human ship literally falling apart, shedding its outer skin and internal components as it pressed against their sanctuary. They could not comprehend the psychology of a species that would destroy itself just to win a fight. To the Aethelgard, victory was the preservation of order. To the humans, victory was the survival of the intent. The shield began to moan, a low-frequency sound that bypassed ears and vibrated in the marrow of the survivors' bones. The golden light was turning a bruised purple as the human engines dumped billions of tons of radioactive waste directly into the contact point. The humans weren't just hitting the shield, they were poisoning it. The lead slurry and industrial runoff from the Great Hammer acted as a physical contaminant, disrupting the purity of the light weave. "Now," Vane whispered. She authorized the final gambit. The Iron Sow, the cruiser that had led the fleet for decades, was rigged with every remaining nuclear charge in the arsenal and set on a collision course with the fracture point. It wasn't a drone. It was a manned vessel, piloted by a skeleton crew of volunteers who had nothing left to lose. As the Iron Sow accelerated, it looked like a rusted needle aiming for the heart of a star. The impact was not a flash, but a slow, grinding intrusion. The ship's reinforced prow buried itself into the shield, the nuclear charges detonating in a sequential chain that created a localized collapse of space-time. The shield didn't just break, it tore. A jagged hole, wide enough for the Great Hammer to pass through, opened in the golden wall. The Great Hammer surged into the hole, its hull sparking and groaning as it scraped against the edges of the collapsing light weave. As it emerged on the other side, the crew looked out at the interior of the redoubt. They saw a system of impossible beauty, planets made of singing crystal, forests that glowed with a soft, bioluminescent pulse, and cities that floated like clouds. For a moment, even the hardened bridge crew went silent. They had found the last garden in the universe. Then the sensors began to chime. The mineralogical readings were coming in. Atmosphere is 80% oxygen-nitrogen mix, the navigator said, his voice trembling. Water is pure. Soil is rich in nitrates. There's enough biomass here to feed the Warrens for 10 generations. The silence on the bridge broke into a roar of cheers. They didn't see a sanctuary, they saw a feast. The conquest of the redoubt was the most brutal chapter of the human expansion. There was no room for diplomacy. The humans needed the space, and the survivors of the old empires were in the way. The landing craft that descended into the crystal cities were not carrying ambassadors. They were carrying bulldozers and chainsaws. The Aethelgard tried to fight back with their elegant light rapiers, but they were cut down by the spray of automatic weapons. The Valshari tried to sing their songs of peace, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of internal combustion engines. The humans moved through the paradise like a swarm of locusts, turning the singing crystals into construction gravel and the glowing forests into timber. They were building their new world on top of the old one before the bodies of the defenders were even cold. Overseer Vane landed her shuttle in the center of what had been the Aethelgard's high temple. She stepped out onto the polished marble, her heavy boots leaving smears of oil on the pristine surface. She looked up at the ceiling, a dome of shifting colors that told the story of the galaxy's birth. She saw the beauty in it, she really did. But she also saw that the marble was a high-quality calcium carbonate that could be used for water purification. She signaled the demolition crews. "Level it," she said. "We need this space for the new refinery." A young Aethelgard survivor, his robes torn and his face bruised, looked at her with a mixture of pity and terror. "Why?" he whispered. "You have won. Why must you destroy everything that we are?" Vane looked at him, and for a second the weight of her years seemed to settle on her shoulders. "Because we don't have the luxury of being you," she said. "You had 100,000 years of peace to build your temples. We had 3 centuries of starvation to build our ships. We don't know how to live in a garden. We only know how to turn a garden into a workshop. If we leave your temples standing, we're just waiting for the day we run out of room again. We're not here to be your friends. We're here to survive you." She turned her back on him as the first demolition charges were set. The temple collapsed in a cloud of white dust, and the sky of the redoubt was soon obscured by the familiar, comforting grey of human smoke. The redoubt became the new center of the human empire. They renamed it New Terra, but it bore no resemblance to the green world of their ancestors. It was a planet of steel, a world-sized factory where the last resources of the Milky Way were being processed for the Great Leap. The High Command relocated from the dark warrens of Earth to the new spires of New Terra, but they brought the darkness with them. They lived in lead-lined halls, protected from the radiation of their own industry, and looked out over a horizon of chimneys and cooling towers. They had achieved what no other species had. They had conquered the galaxy. But in doing so, they had made the galaxy exactly like themselves, heavy, scarred, and relentless. As the preparations for the leap to Andromeda reached their final stages, Vane sat in her office, which was built into the stump of an ancient Valshari mountain. She was old now, her hands gnarled by the cold of space and the vibration of the machines. She received a report that the last of the Oraxen had died out in a containment facility, unable to survive in an atmosphere filled with coal dust. She filed the report without a word. She felt no malice toward the Oraxen, only a dull sense of inevitability. The universe was a closed system, and the humans had simply taken a larger share of the energy. That was the law of the Iron World. There was no room for ghosts in a factory. The first of the world ships, vessels so large they had their own gravitational pull, began to ignite their engines in high orbit. They were filled with millions of humans, the children of the workers who had broken the redoubt. These children had never seen a tree or a clean ocean. They only knew the thrum of the engine and the smell of recycled air. They were the perfect pioneers for the void, beings who felt at home in the dark. As the world ships moved toward the edge of the galaxy, they passed the ruins of the Golden Shield, which now hung like tattered rags in the vacuum. The humans didn't look back. They were looking at the distant spiral of Andromeda, a new garden waiting to be harvested, a new set of gods waiting to be broken. Vane watched the departure from her window. She felt the familiar vibration in the floor, the heartbeat of the human machine. She knew that she would not live to see the arrival in the next galaxy, but she didn't care. The work was moving forward. The weight was being carried. She picked up a small piece of unrefined iron from her desk, a relic from the first mine on the moon. It was cold, heavy, and ugly. She squeezed it in her hand, feeling the hard edges dig into her skin. "We're still here," she whispered to the empty room. "We're still here, and we're still hungry." The engine roar grew louder, a sound that filled the sky and shook the foundations of the world as the humans began their long, heavy march into the infinite. The galaxy behind them was quiet now. The music of the Aethelgard, the whispers of the Oraxen, and the songs of the Valshari were gone. In their place was only the sound of the wind blowing through empty refineries and the low hum of automated miners that would keep digging until the last of the ore was gone. The humans had left a desert, but they had called it progress. And as the last world ship vanished into the dark between galaxies, the Milky Way finally knew the peace that it had sought for eons, the peace of a tomb built by the hands of those who refused to die. The era of iron had reached its zenith, and the universe would never be light again. The intergalactic void was a wasteland of absolute zero and profound nothingness, a gulf of 4 million light-years that separated the depleted Milky Way from the beckoning spiral of Andromeda. To any other species in history, this crossing would have been a suicide mission, a journey through a desert where there was no light to harvest and no matter to consume. But the humans did not fear the void. They had lived in its shadow for their entire existence. The Great Leap was not a fleet of ships, but a mobile industrial continent. The world ships were tethered together by massive carbon nanotube cables, creating a singular, lumbering entity that generated its own localized gravity. They moved not by the grace of the stars, but by the violent, continuous detonation of the very matter they had stripped from the redoubt. They carried their own suns, artificial fusion cores that burned with a harsh, flickering light, casting long, dancing shadows across the steel canyons of the world ships. Inside these hulls, life had been reduced to its most functional elements. There was no art, no philosophy, and no leisure that did not serve the maintenance of the machine. Overseer Vane did not live to see the midpoint of the crossing, but her successor, a man named Thorn, was a creature of the new era. Thorn had been born in the recycling bays of the Great Hammer, and his first memory was the smell of hot lead and the taste of synthetic protein. He was a man of iron and shadow, his body reinforced with cybernetic implants that allowed him to interface directly with the ship's environmental systems. To Thorn, the universe was not a place to be explored, but a set of parameters to be managed. He sat in the command throne of the lead ship, his mind a blur of oxygen pressure readings and fuel consumption rates. He knew that the fleet was losing heat. Every day, the void sapped a little more energy from their hulls, and the artificial suns were growing dimmer. The humans were once again facing their oldest enemy, scarcity, but Thorn did not feel despair. He felt the familiar, grounding weight of a problem that could be solved with more pressure. The fleet encountered the first sign of Andromeda life in the form of a void sower, a being made of dark energy and coherent thought that drifted in the spaces between galaxies, planting the seeds of new stars. The sower was a creature of immense patience and delicate touch, a being that viewed the universe as a long, slow unfolding of potential. When it felt the approach of the human fleet, it did not move to defend itself. It reached out with a telepathic probe, seeking to understand the nature of this new mass. It found a mind that was like a furnace, hot, loud, and filled with the screams of 1 billion ancestors who had died in the mud. The Sower tried to offer the humans a path to transcendence, a way to shed their physical weight and become part of the dark energy that fueled the expansion of the universe. Thorn's response was to authorize the deployment of the Void Traps, massive magnetic nets designed to capture the Sower's coherent energy. The Sower, a being that had existed since the dawn of time, was unmade in a matter of hours. The humans didn't care about its wisdom or its role in the birth of stars. They only cared that its body could be processed into high-density batteries. The dark energy was siphoned off into the fleet's reactors, giving the artificial suns a sudden, violent surge of power. The light in the world ships turned a cold, flickering purple, but it was light nonetheless. The Sower's seeds, the potential for 1,000 new suns, were gathered up and used as abrasive grit for the ship's grinding wheels. This was the ultimate victory of the Iron World. Even the infinite was just another fuel source. Thorn watched the energy levels stabilize and felt a grim satisfaction. The void had tried to freeze them, and they had responded by burning a god to stay warm. As the fleet neared the outskirts of Andromeda, they found that the galaxy was not empty. It was the home of the Eternal Weave, a civilization of hyper-intelligent beings who had long ago uploaded their consciousness into a galactic-scale computer network. The Eternal Weave had no bodies, no ships, and no physical presence. They existed as a series of light pulses traveling through a network of crystalline relay stations that spanned every star in the galaxy. They were the pinnacle of evolution, a species that had entirely transcended the need for matter. When they detected the human fleet, they sent a signal that was a masterpiece of mathematical beauty, a welcome to a new species into the fold of pure thought. The humans didn't even try to translate it. They saw the relay stations, made of high-purity emerald and sapphire, and they saw the energy that pulsed between them. The human conquest of Andromeda was not a war of ships, but a war of physical reality against digital abstraction. The Eternal Weave tried to hack the human systems, seeking to overwhelm their minds with the sheer volume of their knowledge. But the human computers were too primitive to be hacked. They ran on physical switches, copper wiring, and binary logic that was hardened against any form of electromagnetic interference. The Eternal Weave was like a master fencer trying to duel a landslide. They fired beams of information that the humans ignored, and in return, the humans fired clouds of debris that shattered the crystalline relay stations. Every time a station was destroyed, 1 billion minds in the Weave were extinguished, their consciousness lost to the void. The humans weren't fighting a war, they were clearing a path. Thorn watched the emerald light of the Andromeda core flicker and die as the fleet moved inward. He felt no pity for the Eternal Weave. To him, a species that had abandoned its body was a species that had surrendered its right to exist. Matter was the only truth, and weight was the only power. He ordered the world ships to begin the final harvest, the systematic dismantling of the Andromeda stars to provide the mass for the next leap, and the one after that. The humans were no longer just a species, they were a terminal illness for the universe. They would move from galaxy to galaxy, consuming the light and the life they found, until there was nothing left but the cold, heavy iron of their own hulls. They were the entropy they had once feared, the slow, grinding end of all things. In the final centuries of the crossing, the last of the biological humans began to fade. Their bodies, even with the cybernetic implants, could not withstand the constant radiation and the recycled air. They began to replace their organs with steel, their blood with oil, and their minds with databanks of iron logic. They became the very machines they had lived in, a race of metal titans that no longer needed to eat, sleep, or breathe. But they did not lose their hunger. The drive to consume, to grow, and to survive was baked into their code, a relic of the days when they were soft, wet things in the mud of Earth. Thorn, now a towering figure of articulated chrome and glowing sensors, stood on the bridge of a ship that had become his own body. He looked out at the universe and saw only mass to be weighed. The universe was dying, but the humans were thriving. They had turned the stars into batteries and the planets into scrap. They had outlasted the light, the gods, and the dreams of every other species. They were the weight of unrefined iron, the final, stubborn fact of existence. As Thorn looked toward the next galaxy, a distant speck of light in the growing darkness, he felt a strange, metallic sensation that might have been a memory of a smile. He didn't need a reason to keep going. The movement was the reason. The harvest was the goal. The humans had finally achieved their destiny. They had become the silence they had once feared, a cold, mechanical silence that would never, ever end. They were the last thing that would ever happen, and they were ready to begin. The world ships, now a singular, massive ring of dark metal, began to rotate, creating a centrifugal force that acted as a new form of energy. They had become a self-sustaining system, a perpetual motion machine fueled by the debris of 1,000 civilizations. They moved into the darkness between the local group and the next cluster, a wall of iron that blocked out the stars. Behind them, the Milky Way and Andromeda were dark, empty husks, their energy spent and their stories over. Ahead lay the infinite, a vast, unexploited territory for the children of the heavy world. Thorn reached out a hydraulic hand and adjusted the course by a fraction of a degree. "Initiate the next phase," he commanded, his voice a vibration that shook the very fabric of space. The engines roared, a sound of grinding gears and nuclear fire that echoed into the void, and the humans marched on, the only light left in a universe of their own making. The great leap would never end, because the humans would never be satisfied. They were the hunger that could not be fed, the thirst that could not be quenched. They were the ultimate expression of life's will to persist, stripped of all its beauty and all its mercy. In the end, there was only the hammer and the anvil, and the humans were both. They had become the iron heart of the cosmos, beating with a slow, heavy rhythm that would count down the seconds until the heat death of the universe. And even then, in the absolute dark, they would probably still be looking for a way to keep the lights on. They were the humans, the heavy ones, and they were the only ones left.